The wind that scoured the Bighorn foothills had a voice, and for 3 years it had been calling a name that wasn't mine. Jonas McKenna stood with his back to the house, his shadow stretching long and thin in the dying light. The corral post was cold under his bare hand, the chill seeping right through the skin, a cold that felt older than winter. He watched his breath turn to smoke and vanish. He wasn't just lonely, he was haunted. It had started the year his wife, Helen, was taken by the fever. A sound, at first, a whisper in the floorboards, a shadow in the corner of his eye. He'd told himself it was grief, a poison that plays tricks on the mind. But the feeling never left. The feeling of being watched. The house behind him wasn't empty. It was waiting. His mare, Daisy, nudged his sleeve, her soft muzzle a small comfort in the vast, listening silence. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Help is coming." He'd sent a letter to town weeks ago, a simple request, a cook, someone to fill the silence with the clatter of pots and pans to push back the creeping quiet that had owned his home since he'd laid Helen to rest on the hill. He checked the ridge line, a dark slash against a bruised purple sky. The stage was late, far too late, and that cold feeling crawling up his spine told him something was wrong. He wasn't just waiting for a cook. He was waiting for an answer to a question he was too afraid to ask. The sound came first, not the familiar rattle of wheels, but a frantic, desperate drumming. Hooves pounding the frozen earth, too fast, too reckless. Jonas straightened up, his hand dropping to the worn handle of the pistol at his hip. A habit. Then the stagecoach burst over the ridge, silhouetted for a moment against the last sliver of sun. It wasn't rolling, it was fleeing. The horses were wild-eyed, foam flying from their mouths, their muscles straining as the driver lashed them into a full-blown panic. The coach careened into the yard, wheels sloughing sideways in the frost, and skidded to a halt just feet from the water trough. The driver, a wiry man with a face like a clenched fist, didn't even wrap the reins. He vaulted from his seat, his boots hitting the ground with a thud of finality. He looked like a man who'd just outrun the devil himself. He wrenched the door open, his movements jerky and terrified. "Out!" he barked, not at Jonas, but at the shadows inside. "Get out now! This is as far as I go!" Jonas took a step forward, his boots crunching in the thin layer of snow. "What's the trouble?" The driver ignored him. His eyes were locked on the coach's dark interior. A woman appeared in the doorway. She moved with a strange, deliberate calm, a small island of stillness in the driver's storm of fear. She was slim, dressed in a simple gray dress, but there was nothing simple about the look in her eyes. They were green, and they held the kind of exhaustion that comes from running for 1,000 miles. Clutched to her chest was a bundle of blankets, a child, and that's when Jonas felt it. The cold presence from his house seemed to surge forward, a wave of invisible ice washing over the yard, swirling around the woman and her child. The driver saw Jonas watching her. He lowered his voice to a ragged whisper, meant only for Jonas. "You turn her away, mister," the driver hissed, his gaze flicking nervously back down the road they'd just traveled. "Whatever she's running from, it's still coming." With that, he scrambled back onto his seat, whipped the reins, and the stagecoach tore out of the yard without a backward glance, leaving the woman and child standing alone in the deepening twilight. The air grew deathly still. She looked at him, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "Mr. McKenna?" Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a wire pulled taut just before it snaps. Jonas just nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "I'm Mara Whitlow," she said. "You hired a cook." She pulled the blanket tighter around the child, a protective, almost fierce gesture. The letter said nothing about children. "No," Jonas said, his gaze fixed on the small bundle. "It didn't." "He comes with me," she stated, Not an apology, but a fact. A line drawn in the dirt. "I won't leave him." "And if I tell you to go?" Jonas asked, his own voice sounding foreign to his ears. Her chin lifted. The faint light caught the glint of defiance in her eyes. "Then we'll walk. But the road behind us is closed." What did that mean? The road behind us is closed. It wasn't a choice of direction. It was a warning. The wind picked up, moaning around the corners of the house, and it sounded exactly like a woman weeping. The presence. Helen. It was here. It was angry. Jonas looked at the child's hand, a tiny fist clutching the edge of his mother's shawl. He looked at the empty road, now swallowed by darkness. He looked at his house, where the windows stared back like vacant eyes. He was a man caught between two ghosts, the one in his house and the one this woman had brought to his doorstep. "Get inside," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Whatever's out there, it's better than what's in here." He thought he was lying. He was about to find out he was wrong. The warmth of the kitchen should have been comforting. Instead, it felt trapped. The air thick and heavy. Jonas lit a lantern, and the light threw long, dancing shadows across the floorboards. Mara stood near the door, still holding the child, her body poised for flight. She scanned the room, her eyes missing nothing: the worn spot by the stove, the single cup on the counter, the thick layer of dust on the pantry door. Her gaze was that of a soldier assessing a battlefield. "You live alone," she said. It wasn't a question. Jonas ignored it. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, his hands moving with the slow, deliberate motions of a man trying to appear calm. The kettle on the stove began to hiss, a nervous, agitated sound. He set a cup on the table in front of her. "His name?" "Asher," she replied. She finally moved toward the table and, with an almost reverent slowness, began to unwrap the boy. It was as if she were unveiling a priceless, fragile treasure. Jonas watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. The presence in the house felt stronger now, a suffocating pressure in the air. He felt a cold dread pool in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this moment was a turning point, that everything was about to change. The last blanket fell away. The boy's face was turned up toward the lantern light, soft, sleeping features, a small, dark birthmark just above his right eyebrow. Jonas's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen that mark before, every single morning, in his own reflection, but that wasn't the part that made the blood freeze in his veins. The boy blinked, his eyes slowly opening, and he looked directly at Jonas. They were steel blue, clear and steady. They were Jonas's eyes. "He looks—" Jonas started, the words a choked whisper. "He looks just like me." Mara's expression didn't change. No surprise, no shock. Only a deep, bottomless weariness. It was the look of someone who had been carrying a terrible truth for a very long time. "Abilene," she said, her voice flat. 5 years ago. You were passing through. There was a storm, and everyone was crowded into the dance hall." The memory hit him like a physical blow. Kerosene lamps, the smell of wet wool and cheap whiskey, rain hammering on a tin roof, a woman in a blue dress. He'd been drunk, lonely, and trying to forget the first signs of Helen's sickness. "I left the next morning," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I know," she said. "I found out about the boy a month later. I wrote to the address you gave me. The letters all came back." He stared at the child, his child, and a wave of something cold and sharp washed over him. It wasn't joy. It wasn't wonder. It was fear. The weeping sound of the wind outside the window rose to a shriek. A cupboard door in the corner of the kitchen swung open on its own, slowly, deliberately, as if pushed by an unseen hand. Mara's eyes darted to the cupboard, then back to Jonas. For the first time, he saw a flicker of her own fear. She wasn't just running from something on the road. She was afraid of what was in this house, too. "I am not here for your money," she said, her voice dropping, becoming urgent. "I'm here because I had nowhere else to go. The stories, people said this place was empty, cursed. They said no one would look for me here." Cursed. The word hung in the air between them. The boy, Asher, didn't cry. He didn't make a sound. He simply watched Jonas with those unnervingly familiar eyes. Then he slowly lifted a tiny hand and pointed. Not at Jonas. Not at his mother. He pointed at the dark, empty corner behind Jonas's chair. "Sad lady," the boy whispered, his voice as clear as a bell in the silent room. Jonas spun around. There was nothing there. Just shadows. But the air in that corner was colder than a grave. He turned back to Mara, his mind reeling. A son he never knew. A house haunted by his dead wife. And a child who could see her. This wasn't a cook he had hired. This was a reckoning. Jonas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the main room, a shotgun across his lap, listening to the house groan and settle around him. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of a window pane sounded like a footstep. The sad lady. He couldn't shake the boy's words. He had given Mara the small room off the pantry, a space meant for storage. He'd watched her barricade the door from the inside with an old chest of drawers. She wasn't just settling in for the night. She was fortifying a position. What in God's name had he brought into his home? Before the first hint of dawn, a smell crept through the house, not the usual scent of stale air and dust, but coffee, rich and dark, and bread baking. He found Mara in the kitchen, moving with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. The fire in the stove was roaring, casting a warm, dancing light that seemed to hold the shadows at bay. Asher was asleep in a makeshift cot in the corner, a small, still form under a pile of blankets. "You're up early," Jonas said, his voice a low rumble. She didn't turn. "The hungry don't care what time it is," she said, her hands deftly kneading a ball of dough. "And the cold is always hungry." It was a strange thing to say. He looked around the kitchen. It was already different. The counters were wiped clean. The stray pans were stacked. She wasn't just making breakfast. She was claiming territory from the gloom. He poured a cup of the coffee. It was brutally strong, black as sin. He took a sip, and the heat of it was a welcome shock. He nodded toward the sleeping boy. He said, "Last night." "I know what he said," she cut him off, her voice sharp. "He sees things, always has." "Things. Shadows, people who aren't there." She finally turned to face him, wiping a dusting of flour from her cheek with the back of her hand. Her green eyes were intense, demanding. "You have them here, in this house. It's an old cold, an old sadness." Jonas felt his defenses rise. "My wife died in this house." "I know," Mara said softly, and the sharpness in her voice was gone, replaced by something that sounded like pity. "She hasn't left." The bluntness of it stole his breath. People in town whispered. They said he was cursed by grief, but no one had ever said it to his face. No one had ever confirmed the cold dread that he lived with every single day. Asher stirred in his cot, murmuring in his sleep. Not words, but a single repeated sound. A hum, a lullaby. A lullaby Jonas recognized. It was the one Helen used to hum while she worked in her garden. A tune she'd learned from her mother, one he hadn't heard in 3 long years. He looked from the sleeping boy to Mara, 1,000 questions warring in his mind. "How?" he whispered. "How does he know that?" Mara's face was pale. "He hears her," she said. "She sings to him." The idea was monstrous. The ghost of his dead wife, a presence that made his skin crawl and his blood run cold, was singing lullabies to the illegitimate son he'd just discovered. It made no sense. It was a violation of the natural order of things. The kitchen, which a moment ago had felt warm and safe, now felt like a cage. "Do your work outside, Mr. McKenna," Mara said, her voice regaining its iron edge. She turned back to her dough, a clear dismissal. "I'll handle what's in here." He stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, the strong coffee doing little to warm him. The world outside was quiet, blanketed in a fresh layer of snow, but as he looked back at the house, at the single square of yellow light in the kitchen window, he knew he had just walked out of one battle and into another. Mara wasn't just a cook fighting dust and grime. She was a woman fighting a ghost, and Jonas was trapped on the battlefield. That day, the ranch hands came in for their midday meal. 6 weathered men who smelled of leather and cold air. They stamped the snow from their boots and filed into the kitchen, their eyes wide with curiosity. They'd been eating Jonas's grim, repetitive cooking for years. The sight of Mara, a woman standing at the stove in a house that had been without one for so long, struck them silent. The meal she served was simple: a thick beef stew, dense with potatoes and carrots and fresh, warm bread. But to these men, it was a feast. They ate quickly, silently, with a focus that was almost reverent. Jonas sat at the head of the table, watching. He watched his men, and he watched Mara. She moved around the room with a purpose he hadn't seen in this house since Helen was alive. Refilling bowls, placing another platter of bread on the table. She didn't speak unless spoken to. One of the hands, a big man named Miller with a thick beard and suspicious eyes, finally broke the silence. Miller had been with Jonas the longest. He'd been there when Helen died. "Stew's good, ma'am," he said, pushing his empty bowl forward. "Thank you," Mara replied, her voice even. Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "Funny thing, though. Haven't had stew this good since Mrs. McKenna used to make it." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. "She used a lot of time, just like this." Jonas's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at Mara. Her expression was unreadable. She hadn't asked him how Helen cooked. She couldn't have known. The other men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bringing up the dead missus was bad form. Mara simply picked up Miller's bowl. "I find time keeps the meat honest," she said, her voice cool. But Jonas saw it, a tremor in her hand. So slight, if he hadn't been watching for it, he would have missed it. After the men had filed out, their curiosity replaced by a hushed respect for the food, Jonas stayed behind. Mara was at the sink, washing the heavy bowls, her back to him. "How did you know about the thyme?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't turn around. "It's a common herb. Not the way she used it. She put whole sprigs in, took them out at the end. I saw you do the same thing." The water stopped running. Mara stood perfectly still for a long moment. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip from the tap. Finally, she turned, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "She told me," Mara said. Jonas stared at her, his mind refusing to accept the words. "Who told you?" "Your wife," Mara whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. "She was standing right behind you while you were eating. She was helping." A cold wave rolled through the room. The ghost of his wife wasn't just singing lullabies to his son. She was giving his new cook recipes from beyond the grave. This was insane. It had to be a lie, a trick. Mara was a grifter, a clever charlatan playing on his grief, trying to cement her place in his home. Miller's suspicion was right. "Get out," Jonas said, the words tearing from his throat, raw and angry. Mara flinched as if he'd struck her. "What?" "You heard me. Pack your things. Take the boy. I want you gone by nightfall." He expected her to argue, to plead. Instead, a look of profound and terrible sadness settled over her features. She nodded once, a small, defeated gesture. "I understand," she said softly. But it's not me you're afraid of, Mr. McKenna. She turned and walked to the small pantry room. He heard the sound of the chest being dragged away from the door. He stood there, his anger warring with a terrifying thought. What if she was telling the truth? What if the ghost in his house wasn't trying to drive her away? What if it wanted her here? He walked over to the stove. The pot of stew was still there, a little left in the bottom. He picked up a spoon and tasted it. Thyme, strong and clear. It tasted of memory. It tasted of home. It tasted exactly like Helen's. And in that moment, Jonas didn't know who to fear more. The woman who could talk to the dead, or the ghost who was talking back. He didn't make her leave. The words were stuck in his throat. He watched her pack her few meager belongings into a worn cloth bag, her movements slow and deliberate. He watched her wrap Asher in his blankets, the boy's blue eyes watching him over his mother's shoulder, full of a silent, knowing sorrow. And he couldn't do it. Driving them out into the cold, into the path of whatever they were running from, felt like a cruelty he couldn't commit. Or maybe, just maybe, he was too afraid to be alone again with the ghost that now had a voice. He told her to stay. He didn't explain why. She didn't ask. She simply unpacked her bag, the relief on her face so subtle it was almost invisible. An uneasy truce settled over the house. Days were for work. Jonas and his men worked the ranch, their hard labor a welcome distraction. Mara worked the kitchen, transforming it from a place of ghosts into a place of life. The smells of baking bread and roasting meat pushed back against the ever-present chill. But the nights were different. The nights belonged to the silence and to the whispers. Jonas started noticing things, small, impossible things. A book of Helen's poetry left open on a table to a specific page. A rocking chair in the parlor moving on its own, a slow, steady rhythm. And Asher. The boy was the conduit. One afternoon, Jonas came inside to find Asher sitting on the floor, playing with a small carved wooden bird. It was crudely made, but the shape was unmistakable. A bluebird. Jonas's blood ran cold. He had carved a bird just like that for Helen on their first anniversary. He'd buried it with her. "Where did you get that?" Jonas asked, his voice tight. Asher looked up, his expression serene. "The sad lady gave it to me. She said you lost yours." Jonas backed away slowly, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. This was too much. The ghost wasn't just communicating. It was giving gifts. It was weaving itself into the fabric of their lives through his son. He had to know more about Mara. He had to understand what she was and why she was here. If she was a grifter, she was the most convincing one he'd ever met. If she wasn't, then the world was a far stranger and more terrifying place than he had ever imagined. He waited until she and the boy were asleep. Then, with a lantern in his hand and guilt coiling in his stomach, he went to the small room off the pantry. Her bag was tucked under the cot. His hands trembled as he reached for it. He felt like a thief, a trespasser. But he had to know. The bag contained very little. A spare dress, worn thin at the elbows. A small comb with a tooth missing. A packet of dried herbs. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a small silver locket. It was tarnished with age. He worked it open with his thumbnail. He expected to see a picture of himself, perhaps. Or maybe Asher's. But it was neither. On one side was a miniature portrait of a man Jonas had never seen before. A handsome man with dark, cold eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. His face in the portrait had been violently scratched out, the silver underneath gouged and ruined. On the other side was a tiny, folded piece of paper. Jonas carefully unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle with age. A wanted poster. It described a woman wanted for questioning in a fire that had killed a prominent landowner in a territory 200 miles south. The reward was substantial, The name on the poster was not Mara Whitlow, but the face in the crude drawing, though rough, was unmistakably hers. Jonas stared at the poster, the locket, the scratched-out face of the stranger. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture that was uglier than any ghost story. Mara Whitlow wasn't her real name. She wasn't just a woman with a secret. She was a fugitive, a wanted woman, maybe even a killer. And Jonas had just invited her into his haunted house, into his life, and into the life of his son. The threat wasn't just from the supernatural. It was standing in the next room. The next few days were a quiet, nerve-shredding hell. Jonas said nothing. He watched Mara, seeing her now through a new lens. Every kind gesture seemed like a deception. Every meal she cooked felt like it could be poisoned. He watched the way she bolted the door at night, the way she startled at the sound of a horse riding too close to the house. She wasn't afraid of a ghost. She was afraid of being found. Miller, the grizzled ranch hand, watched her too. His suspicion had been simmering, and now it was coming to a boil. He'd cornered Jonas in the barn one morning, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. "Something's not right with her, boss," Miller said, not looking at Jonas, but at the house. "She's got the look of a spooked horse, always watching the road." "She's had a hard life," Jonas said, the lie tasting sour. "Hard life don't make you look over your shoulder every 5 minutes," Miller countered. "Trouble does, the kind that follows a person." Miller was right. And Jonas was living a lie, protecting a woman who was very likely a dangerous criminal. He was harboring a fugitive. Why? Because of a boy with his eyes? Because she could bake bread and her stew tasted like a memory? He felt like a fool. A man drowning, clinging to a piece of driftwood that was actually an anchor. The breaking point came during a trip to town for supplies. Jonas left Mara at the ranch, a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. He needed space to think. The general store was warm, smelling of kerosene, burlap, and chewing tobacco. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson with a face full of gossip, bagged up flour and salt pork. "Heard you got yourself a cook," Henderson said, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "A woman and a kid." "That's right," Jonas said, his tone clipped. Henderson leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You be careful, Jonas. Man in your position. A lonely man with a big ranch. You're a target for a certain kind of woman." He paused for dramatic effect. "Sheriff from down south came through here last week asking questions, showed me a poster." Jonas's blood turned to ice. "A poster?" "Yeah, for a woman. Caused a whole mess of trouble down in the Red Valley territory. Burned a man's house down. Killed him, they say." Henderson shook his head. "Looked a bit like that new cook of yours now that I think on it. Dark hair, green eyes." The world tilted on its axis. It was real. Not just a clipping in a locket, but a real sheriff, a real investigation. She was being hunted. Jonas paid for his supplies, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. He rode out of town, the horse sensing his agitation, its steps skittish. He didn't go straight home. He couldn't. He rode up to the hill where Helen was buried, the simple wooden cross a stark shape against the gray sky. "What do I do, Helen?" he whispered to the wind. "What in God's name do I do?" The wind offered no answer. But as he stood there, a strange sense of calm washed over him. A thought, clear and sharp, that didn't feel like his own. "The danger is not in the house. The danger is coming to the house." It was Helen's voice in his head. Or maybe it was his own grief, finally gone mad. But it felt real. He spurred his horse and rode for home, a desperate plan forming in his mind. He would confront Mara. He would get the truth, all of it. And then he would hand her over to the law. It was the only sane, logical thing to do. He rode into the yard, just as a blizzard began to blow in from the north, the sky turning a dark, bruised gray. The first flakes of snow were thick and wet, and the wind had a vicious bite. He burst into the kitchen, the cold and snow swirling in with him. Mara was there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear he had never seen before. Asher was clinging to her skirts, crying silently. "There's a rider coming," she said, her voice trembling. "One rider. He's been following the creek line, staying out of sight." Jonas went cold. It was the sheriff. He'd found her. "Pack your things," he said, his voice hard as iron. "The law is here for you." He expected denial, lies, pleading. Instead, she looked at him and her face crumbled. "It's not the law," she whispered, her voice choked with terror. "It's him. Him? The man from the locket," she sobbed. "My husband. He's found us." Before Jonas could even process the words, the kitchen door flew open with a deafening crash. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that was a mask of cold fury. His eyes were the same dead, cruel eyes from the portrait in the locket. He held a long-barreled revolver in his hand, and it was pointed directly at Mara. "Hello, Abigail," the man said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Did you really think you could run from me?" The ghost in his house wasn't the real monster. Jonas had just let the real monster in. The man's name was Elias Thorne, and the story Mara, or Abigail, told in frantic, terrified whispers was uglier than Jonas could have imagined. Elias was a wealthy landowner, a man who ruled his corner of the world with fear and an iron fist. He wasn't just her husband, he was her keeper. Their marriage had been an arrangement, a cage she'd been sold into. The night she met Jonas in Abilene was the one and only time she had ever been free. A stolen evening, a moment of warmth in a life of cold misery. When Elias discovered she was pregnant, and that the child could not possibly be his cruelty had escalated into a murderous rage. He'd locked her away, planning to get rid of the child the moment it was born. The fire. She had set the fire, not to kill him, but as a diversion, a desperate act to create a moment of chaos so she could escape with her newborn son. Elias had survived, enraged and obsessed. He'd used his wealth and influence to put out the story that she had tried to murder him, creating the wanted poster himself. It wasn't the law that was hunting her. It was him. He had been tracking her for years, a relentless predator closing in on his prey. "He's not your son, Cowboy," Elias sneered, his revolver never wavering from Mara. "He's mine, property, just like she is." Jonas looked at Mara, saw the truth of her story in her terrified eyes. He looked at Asher, the boy who had his face, cowering behind his mother. And he looked at the monster who had just kicked in his door. The presence in the house, Helen's ghost, had been trying to warn him. The danger is coming to the house. It wasn't about Mara. It was about Elias. In that instant, everything shifted. The fear, the confusion, it all burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty. "You are not welcome in this house," Jonas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Elias laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This house?" He gestured around the simple kitchen with his gun. "This shack? I'll burn it to the ground with all of you inside, but first, the boy comes with me." He took a step forward, and that's when Miller appeared in the back doorway, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in his big hands. The other ranch hands were behind him, armed with rifles and pistols. They'd seen the stranger ride in. They'd heard the door crash. "I reckon the boy's staying right where he is," Miller said, his voice a low growl. Elias froze, his eyes darting between Jonas and the armed men behind him. He was trapped. The hunter had walked into a den of wolves, his face contorted with rage. "You have no idea who I am." "We know what you are," Jonas said. He took a deliberate step to the side, placing himself between Elias and Mara. "And your kind ain't welcome here." The air was thick with tension, a single spark away from an explosion of violence. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like angry fists. Elias's eyes, cold and reptilian, locked onto Jonas. He saw the defiance there. He saw a man who would die before he gave up the woman and child behind him. His cruel smile returned. "Fine," he hissed. "If I can't have them, no one can." He swung his revolver, not toward Jonas, but toward the boy. Time seemed to slow down. The world narrowed to the dark, round muzzle of that gun. A loud roar filled the room, but it wasn't the sound of Elias's pistol. It was Miller's shotgun. The blast threw Elias backward, slamming him against the doorframe. He slid to the floor, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing into a heap. Silence descended upon the room, broken only by the howling of the blizzard and Asher's terrified sobs. It was over. Jonas rushed to Mara and the boy, pulling them into an embrace. He could feel her whole body shaking, feel the boy's small hands clutching his shirt. He looked over at Miller, who stood with smoke curling from the barrels of his shotgun. "Some trouble," Miller said, spitting on the floor. "You just gotta put down." Jonas nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He held his family close, the warmth of them a shield against the cold of the world. He realized in that violent, terrifying moment that's what they were, his family. The blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping them all inside the house. It was a strange, suspended time. Elias Thorne's body was wrapped in a canvas and stored in the coldest part of the barn, a grim reminder of the violence that had invaded their lives. No one spoke of it. Instead, a new, quieter rhythm took hold. The ranch hands, their loyalty now cemented in blood, treated Mara with a gruff, protective reverence. Miller, in a rare show of softness, carved Asher a new, more detailed wooden horse. In the quiet moments, Mara, Abigail, told Jonas everything. Her real name was Abigail Carden. She told him about her lonely, frightened childhood, her forced marriage, and the years of quiet desperation. She had chosen the name Mara because it meant bitter, a reflection of the life she'd been forced to live. Jonas listened, and the last of his suspicion withered and died, replaced by a deep, aching protectiveness. This woman hadn't brought trouble to his door. She had brought him a son, and she had brought his house back to life. And the ghost? Helen's presence had changed. The cold spots were gone. The weeping sound in the wind had quieted. There was a sense of peace in the house now, a feeling of stillness and resolution. It was as if, by protecting this new family, Jonas had finally laid his first wife's spirit to rest. She hadn't been a vengeful spirit. She had been a guardian, waiting to make sure he wouldn't be alone. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The world was blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of white. The sun shone with a blinding intensity. Jonas and Miller rode out, taking Thorne's body with them. They left him miles from the ranch, in a deep snow-filled ravine, where he wouldn't be found until the spring thaw, if ever. The story for the law, if anyone ever came asking, would be simple. A stranger, caught in a blizzard. No one would question it. When Jonas rode back into the yard, Mara was waiting on the porch, her face turned up to the sun. Asher was at her side, stamping his new boots in the fresh snow. Jonas swung down from his horse and walked toward her. He stopped in front of her, taking her hands in his. They were chapped and work-worn, but they were strong. "Abigail," he began, using her real name for the first time. She shook her head, a small, sad smile on her face. "That person is gone. She died in a fire a long time ago. I am Mara." He nodded, understanding. "Mara, then." He took a deep breath. "This ranch, this house, it needs a family. It needs you, and him." Her green eyes searched his, full of a hope so fragile he was afraid it might break. "What are you saying, Jonas?" "I'm saying I don't want to cook," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want a wife. And Asher. I want him to be my son, in name as well as blood." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing shining paths down her cheeks. She didn't speak. She just threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tight, the years of loneliness and grief finally, completely washing away. Asher watched them, a slow, happy grin spreading across his face. He ran forward and wrapped his small arms around Jonas's legs. The three of them stood there on the porch, bathed in the bright, cold sunlight, a broken, haunted man and a hunted, terrified woman, and the boy who had brought them together. They were a patchwork family, stitched together by secrets, ghosts, and violence. But they were whole. And for the first time in a very long time, the house behind them felt truly, completely warm. The years that followed were quiet. The land was hard and the winters were long. But the bitterness Mara had named herself after began to fade, replaced by a quiet, resilient joy. They were married by a traveling preacher that spring, with Miller as the witness, Jonas McKenna, Mara McKenna, and their son, Asher McKenna. The names had a rightness to them, a solid, grounding weight. The story of the man in the blizzard became a local legend, a cautionary tale told on cold nights. No one ever connected it to the quiet, hard-working woman who ran the McKenna Ranch kitchen. Abigail Carden was a ghost, a name on a faded poster, and she never bothered them again. Asher grew tall and strong, with his father's steady blue eyes and his mother's quiet determination. He learned the rhythms of the ranch, his laughter a constant welcome sound in the old house. The sad lady never visited him again. Her work was done. One evening, years later, Jonas stood on the porch, watching the sun set behind the Bighorn foothills. The sky was streaked with pink and gold. Mara came to stand beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. Her hair was starting to show threads of silver, and the lines around her eyes spoke of laughter, not fear. Asher, now a young man, was in the corral, expertly calming a new colt, with a gentle voice and a steady hand. He looked up and saw them watching, and he smiled. It was Jonas's smile. "You were right, you know," Jonas said softly. "About what?" Mara asked. "That day in the kitchen, when you said the hungry don't care what time it is." He turned to look at her, his heart full. "My whole life I was starving. I just didn't know it until you walked through that door." She smiled, a real, unguarded smile that still made his chest ache. "We fed each other, Jonas." He wrapped his arm around her, and they stood together, watching their son, watching the day end. The wind came down from the mountains, but now it was just the wind. It didn't whisper names. It didn't sound like weeping. It was just the sound of the world breathing, peaceful and calm. The haunting was over. The hunt was over. All that was left was home. The story of Jonas and Mara became its own kind of legend on that stretch of land. A story about how sometimes the things we think are coming to haunt us are actually coming to save us. About how a family isn't always something you're born into, but something you build and fight for and protect with everything you have. If you enjoyed this story and the strange and mysterious journey of the McKenna family, don't forget to like and subscribe. You never know what other secrets are buried just waiting to be uncovered.